You've got the basics of ggplot, so how do you make further customizations to your graph? There are all kinds of additional things you can do. We can't possibly cover them all in a video, but I'd like to give you some starters. Maybe you want to put a title on your graph. To do that, we're going to add a layer. We're going to do plus, and we're going to do gg title, my title here. And you'll see that now we have a title at the top of our plot. Perhaps you want to change something about the x and the y axes. Previously, we used the labs function to add labels on the x and y axes. But if you want to do more things, you want to use a scale. We could use scale x continuous. Scale x continuous gives you lots of options, as you see popped up here in the middle of my RStudio window. So you can give your scale a name. That name could be the same as what we previously chose for our x-axis label. The name is what's going to go along the bottom of the axis. You can give it limits. So maybe I want the limits of my scale, instead of going roughly from 3 to 5, maybe I want them to go from, say, 1 to 7. And you can do other things here also. There's lots of options for how you can change your scale. If I go ahead and run this code, you can see how it changes things. I now have the limits going further across, and I still have my name down there. Perhaps on the y-axis, where we have GDP expressed as a fraction of US GDP, we'd rather have those numbers in percentages instead of decimals. We could do that with scale y continuous, where our name is going to be the name taken from down here. And then we might want to change the labels. So for labels here, we can do labels. And then there are lots of ways to change the labels on your axis. Something that I often like to do is to use the scales package, which gives us additional functionality for using scales. I can do this at the top of my R script by loading the scales package. If you haven't installed it, remember to install with install.packages scales. I can then say labels are going to be label %. And boom, we have our labels on the y-axis in percents. Okay, I'm going to take off these x-axis limits here because I actually don't like how it looks as much with them. And go back to our basic plot. Maybe you want to add labels on the points. We could do this with geom text. So just like geom point, we have geom text. Let's look at the help file for geom text. To do that, go to your console, type $geom_text. You can actually do this for any function you're using in R. There's always going to be a help file you can pull up. So this is useful for labeling plots. We can look down here and see what the arguments to this function are. Often, I find it most helpful to scroll to the very bottom and to look at the examples. So if you scroll to the bottom here, you're going to find a bunch of examples. So for example, we can have geom text here where there's an aesthetic for some label that they're going to put on each point. So let's go ahead and add an aesthetic for the label. So we're going to have mapping equals AES, label equals, let's label each point with the country. So if I run that code, we now have on top of our points, we have the label for the country. This is great because now we can see that this outlier case, the US with very high inequality and very high economic productivity, is far away from all the other data points in our graph. Now you might not like how the labels are on top of the dots. If you're concerned about that, you could Google, how do I get my labels in ggplot to not be on top of my dots? If you did that, you would likely come over here and find that there is the ggRepel package. The ggRepel package will put labels repelled away from the points. And it works like this. I'm going to go up here, and I'm going to load the ggRepel package, just as we've loaded the other ones. And now instead of geom text, I'm going to use geom text repel. And look at that. Now my labels are no longer on top of my dots, and they're scooched away from each other so that we can read them all. In general, when you try to do something with a ggplot, you can often Google and find a solution to do what you'd like to do. It's going to require you to read some documentation. Now, something that you'll have to do on the homework is to use facet grid. I'm not going to explain facet grid very much here, but you'll note that if you search for it, you'll find the help file for facet grid, just as we just did for geom text repel. You can see that facet grid has a whole bunch of arguments. If you scroll down in the help file, you'll find examples of how this works. So we can see that facet grid can have a set of variables placed along the rows and a set of variables placed along the columns. In this case, you put vars, parentheses, and then the name of the variable that should form the rows, and the name of the variable that should form the columns. If you want to give an argument name to those arguments, you can see up at the top that this would be rows equals vars, name of your variables, cols equals vars, name of your variables. I'm going to leave it to you to read some more on the documentation of Facet Grid and ask questions on Piazza if you get stuck in that part of the homework. And this is about it for our learning of ggplot. ggplot is a really powerful tool, and you'll get the most out of it by playing with it yourself and searching for the help files when there's something you want to do that you're not quite sure how to work with in code. Once you know how to make a ggplot with a data and a mapping argument, and then begin adding layers to your ggplot, you're well on your way to making any graph that you'd like to produce.